something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop.
Hi, my name's Joe Tyndall, and welcome to episode 33 of Occupy TV, and I have the pleasure of sitting opposite Bill Ayers. So welcome to the show.
The privilege is mine. Thanks for having me.
And I guess we started before. We talked about a whole bunch of different things about organizing, about back in the dim past, what activism was like and what it's like today. So why don't we start there with kind of what's the difference between then and now?
Then meaning the 60s? Is that what you're referencing?
60s. Well, I mean, the 60s really sort of started in the middle and went to the middle of the 70s, but yeah, something like that.
That's a nice way to put it. I think the 60s started in the 30s, and it's not over yet, so I have a different time frame. Well, I can say it differently than that. I think that the 60s is mostly myth and symbol, and it's mostly sold back to us in a package that's unrecognizable to anyone who was there. So to hear some people tell it the 60s was the devil's own workshop and changed the country for the worse. To hear others tell it, there was never a time like it. We had the best music, the best sex, the best demonstrations. And my response to that is always to say, don't worry, sex is still good. The music is still productive and generative. And frankly, the biggest demonstration I ever went on in my life was 2003. So the idea that somehow the 60s was the highest point of everything. And you're old enough to know that none of us on December 31st, 1969 looked at our watches and said, oh, damn, it's almost over.
I missed it.
I missed it. I better get in a hurry. So I like your way of saying you're dating it from, say, the beginning of the American war against Vietnam to the end of the American war against Vietnam. But if you think about all the elements that built into that upheaval, and then you've got black resistance in the South.
Let's go right back to the 30s and talk about that.
Well, I mean,
that's really what set up the 60s. I mean, it's our grandparents' generation and what they did, and going through the Depression and saying, I mean, there's this official story that the Depression was caused by speculation in the stock market and all that.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain anything
because
in reality, it doesn't matter who owns it. None of the factories vaporized because there was stuff in the stock market. Nobody didn't want to buy things. The problem was they couldn't buy things. They didn't have any money.
Right. And if we wanted to, or if we had some other folks sitting around the table, we might go back to the 20s, the teens, the turn of the century, the Civil War.
Absolutely.
Many people have said that the Civil Rights Movement was the last battle of the Civil War. And that's an interesting framework. But I guess what I would say is I'm skeptical at any kind of chunking of history and saying this is where it begins and this is where it ends. And I'm deeply skeptical of any kind of causal claims. I remember vividly a wonderful kind of interview where a French journalist asked Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China in the 60s. And this journalist said to Zhou Enlai, what was the relationship between the French Revolution in the 18th century and the Chinese Revolution in the 20th century? And Zhou Enlai's response was, it's too soon to tell. And so, we shall see what caused what. The one thing I'm certain of is that whatever the 60s was and whatever this product is that they're selling us, it was prelude to today.
Yeah.
So any old person who's kind of looking nostalgically to a ship that already left the shore is not only depressing, but has their head in the wrong place, because what we ought to recognize is that you and I mean, you're a gray-haired guy, and I'm a gray-haired guy. I'm a no-haired guy. You and I are of this generation. We are living now. And the idea that we lived once and now we're kind of zombies, the Walking Dead, isn't true. I'm part of this generation. So young people, my granddaughters, my children, and all the young students that I'm in touch with and part of, we're part of the same generation. And the question is, what are we going to do now? Leaning forward, not what was the great glory of the past. I think that's kind of a nonsensical way to think.
Yeah. Well, let's key. There's a lot of things we could grab out of what you just said. But let's go back to the civil rights movement being the last battle of the Civil War. I mean, it isn't even close to the last battle.
I agree with you.
Because we haven't even come close to dealing with the economic inequality.
No, and not only the economic. I mean, and you're right. I mean, Martin Luther King. One of the things that we conveniently forget about the mythologized king is that King, in the last 3 years of his life, was making a very explicit connection between racial justice, global justice, or peace, and economic justice. And it was that combination that made his message so radical and so powerful. But the radical King gets swept away. So, but I agree with you. I think saying the last battle makes a lot of mistakes. For one thing, we're looking at, and it's right in front of our eyes, mass incarceration as a strategy for dealing with the black freedom.
And the death penalty becomes the new lynching.
Absolutely. In fact, if you take a map of the United States and you overlay lynchings at the end of the last century with the death penalty this century, you will see a pattern that says it's the new lynching. And the same is true.
It's a perfect correlation.
It's a perfect correlation, but the same is true of mass incarceration. So the civil rights movement, one of its tactical goals, one of its strategic goals was the vote. But mass incarceration takes away the vote. And so suddenly in places like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, people who fought for the vote, 40 years ago and won the vote putatively, find themselves unable to vote in large numbers. So even on the most superficial level, it's not over. But there's one other note I would add to that, which is, to the extent that the struggle for, say, multiculturalism or racial justice was a struggle for access. On November 4th, 2008, that struggle was won definitively, and it was the end of multiculturalism as a viable or important goal. In other words, if a few African American people can get into the highest levels of business, law, university, sports, entertainment, and even politics.
But why sports? What happened with sports? What was different? Why is it that there's so many really good black athletes?
I have no idea. Okay. You're asking again for a causal speculation. I have no idea. But
there is a causal speculation.
I'm sure. But
the thing is that during the time of slavery, there was in fact selective breeding. So they wanted to breed bigger, stronger slaves. And the net result of that is that black men are physically, on the whole, bigger and stronger than your general cohort.
You're dangerously walking into the Jimmy the Greek problem, and they're going to fire you from the TV station for that kind of speculation. Although I doubt that you could be fired.
I don't think it's speculation. I think it's actually, it makes a reasonably good case. But still, move on.
Well, let me go back to the question of breaking in and access to the highest levels, because I think when Barack Obama ascended to the presidency, we saw the end of kind of access as the goal. It was the end of multiculturalism, but it was a kind of multiculturalism. I think of it as a Noah's Ark kind of multiculturalism, two of everything and the rest of you can drown. So we have access, but do we have justice? We have access, but do we have the end of racism or white supremacy? And the answer is we don't. And so the struggle continues. So no, I don't think the civil rights movement was the last battle of the Civil War. I think the struggle against, for example, mass incarceration is today's new battle against white supremacy. And there are many other examples. So I don't think that we can say it's over. But what we can say, I think for sure, and absolutely definitively, is that regardless of how we experience our daily lives, we are living in the swirl of history. Nothing is done. Everything is in motion. You and I are works in progress, but we're swimming through a dynamic sea of history. And what we do or don't do actually makes a difference. Enter Occupy, which I think has created an unbelievably different landscape than existed a year ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Unpredictable. Like every movement. I mean, what's so interesting to me about Occupy is like every social movement or every revolution, the minute before it happened, it was impossible. And none of us predicted it. The minute after it happened, it seemed so inevitable. And they have done, and power has responded in the way power always responds. They've ignored it, ridiculed it, tried very hard to co-opt it, beat the crap out of it, and then repeat that again and again. But Occupy has changed the frame of what we're talking about in this country. It's now incumbent upon us to enter that public space, which has been opened, to bring our grievances and also our hopes and dreams, and then to make something of it. And that's, I think, where we are. Very exciting moment.
So where do we go from here? What do we do? How do we do it?
Well, I like the question, where do we go from here? And I'll add to that. I'll put a question mark on that, which is the title of a book by Martin Luther King, Where Do We Go From Here?
Yep.
And his subtitle was Chaos or Community. Marx's subtitle was Barbarism or Socialism. But I think that where we go from here in the short term is that we, on the one hand, recognize the changed situation, that the frame that we're talking about is quite different than it was a year ago.
Right.
Nobody cared about Mitt Romney's taxes. Nobody cared that, nobody knew about the 1%, or we didn't think of it that way. So, but that frame has been changed. And so I think where we go from here is organizing. I think where we go from here is talking to strangers. And as when we were talking earlier, this was very much in my mind, that it's not simply a matter of all of us getting together and encouraging one another, which we should do. It's not simply a matter of creating a public space where our opinions and ideas and grievances and dreams can be heard, but it's a matter of reaching out to that larger community and trying to organize. And to me, that means the summary is very easy to say. Talk to strangers.
That's it.
Talk to strangers. And so in a place like Eugene, it's certainly not enough for a bunch of smart kids who are aware of a lot of things and really see the world to sit on their couch and be cynical or skeptical or smoke a joint and feel good about themselves. We have to go out into the neighborhoods we're not used to. We have to talk to the people we don't easily talk to.
We're talking knocking on doors?
Knocking on doors is part of it. But it depends on your position. Depends on where you are. Let's say you're a student living in a dorm.
Right.
You should go talk to the people who you don't agree with, the kids who are, glued to the tube at the NFL draft. Talk to them and find the common ground, or find a way to be persuasive to them. One of the things that worries me always, and it worries me about progressives and radicals in all contexts, is that we tend to barricade ourselves. We tend to think that we're either under such assault that we can't raise our heads up and be noisy and outrageous. This is very true in the school wars.
Yeah.
That school teachers feel so embattled that they're hard pressed to push out what they really believe. But the other thing we sometimes think is our ideas are so precious, so well conceived, so thought through, so based on so many interesting books we've read and so on, that we can't possibly communicate to a wider audience. And it's not true. We have to find a language that we can talk to the Tea Party with, that we can find a way to challenge and find a common ground of language that we can talk.
So when we talk about finding that common ground, I don't think it's going to be language that's the issue. I think it's going to be values. In the sense, use language to express values, but I really think that that there's a complete two worlds of internal frame, and the society has largely been split down the middle, and the middle has been cleared out. In other words, the sort of corporate propaganda thing has kind of either pulled people off to the right, or by reading and looking elsewhere, they've been pulled, call it, to the left. We have this thing about college makes people liberal or progressive, and so it's bad. This is kind of the Rick Santorum thing.
Yeah.
You don't need college because it'll interfere with your belief structures.
Right.
And if you shine a little more light, you get a little more knowledge. You think it through a little bit. A lot of these beliefs that we hold about American exceptionalism or just that, we'll stay with that one.
American exceptionalism
that gets challenged hugely in colleges, because we begin to look at history and say, oh, well, that wasn't so exceptional. Oh, this one wasn't so exceptional. Oh, well, we had this war. Oh, we did this. And so maybe it's not so exceptional. Or take healthcare. I mean, the World Health Organization put us at, their 2000 study said that we were 37th in terms of overall outcomes, over a broad spectrum of metrics. And yet we're number one in how much we pay. Okay, and this year 100,000 people are going to die in this country from, lack or denial of service. I mean, when I started talking about healthcare years ago, back in about 2004, it was at 19,000 people were going to die there, which put it about number 10 in the list. Then In 2007, it had risen to 30,000 people were going to die that year, which meant that it moved up to number 7 as the leading cause of death in the country. It had just edged out firearms, people shooting each other. Okay, and now it's up to 100,000, which means that it's number 3. Cigarettes will kill 450,000 people this year.
Wow.
Okay. Diet and lack of exercise will kill 300,000 people, and denial of service, for a lot of people, because even if they have health insurance, is the number 3 killer in the United States right now.
You bring to mind.
Are we proud of that?
Well, I mean,
that's the issue. Is what's the value?
Sure.
Are we proud of that?
Well, I think I want to return to the question of values and ethics, because I agree with you absolutely that that's where the struggle has to take place. But what you brought to mind just now is that my partner of 40 years was on a mission in Colombia to with a group of radical nuns to bring supplies and law to a settlement out in the countryside in Colombia. And she came back to the United States with a flesh-eating infection in her leg. And by the time she got back here, there was serious talk in this medical staff in Chicago about amputating her leg. And they saved her leg and they saved her life, and it was a touch and go. But she spent 3 weeks in the hospital at Northwestern University with the Cadillac of health care and the Cadillac of health insurance. And of course, we were grateful. But I read during that 3 weeks she was in the hospital, there was a story that you might have seen in the New York Times and then on the national news about a 12-year-old boy in Washington, D.C., for lack of $40 to get a tooth pulled, developed a brain infection that killed him very rapidly. And that's exactly right. Is this really the moral ground we want to stand on, where somebody has $100,000 of health care that's taken care of, and somebody is lacking $40 of health care that would save his life? I agree with you that it's a profoundly moral and ethical issue.
Exactly.
And one of the things I liked, I mean, when I first saw Michael Moore's movie Sicko, I was at first somewhat disappointed that it wasn't more Algorian, more charts and graphs and teaching. And then I kind of realized that he was doing something profoundly different. What he was doing was putting up a frame. And here's how I would describe the frame of healthcare today. And it's two American values in conflict.
Exactly.
On the one hand, if I say to a group of folks, if I say to you, don't you think you have responsibility for your health care and the health care of your family? And yes, I do. I feel responsible. I want to take responsibility. And then if I said to you, somebody was hit by a car right out in front, should we go help him? We'd thunder out to help him. So the question is, which is the metaphor for health care? Is it that we as a community are going to go help that person who is hurt? Or is it that you take responsibility for yourself regardless? And I think that's what Michael Moore did so brilliantly in that film, is he raised that issue. So healthcare is simply one example of having this argument on the level of not just personal virtue, but on the level of social ethics. Healthcare is one example, but there are many. And I think that it's our responsibility as radicals, and by radicals I mean people who want to go to the root of things and see the cause of things, not simply stop this war, but stop the system that creates war. And if we think that way, then I think it's absolutely our responsibility to enter the field of value discussions. And the two values that I just mentioned are very much in play. How much are we the right of the individual to freedom, and how much are we the responsibility of each of us to all of us? And those are things we need to keep finding ways to talk about. And in those conversations, I must tell you, in the last few years where I've been talking to the Tea Party kind of on a weekly basis, I find lots and lots and lots of common ground.
Enormous common ground.
I don't feel that they're somehow the great unwashed that I can't talk to. Sometimes I think I don't know a good way to talk to folks, and I have to get better at that. But even on something as simple as taxing and spending. I was in Georgia, and a bunch of Tea Party people came to picket me and then to heckle me. But after I spoke, one of the leaders of the group said that he thought I was pretty compelling, and then he said, but I think you're a big government guy. And I said, I'm not. And he said, I think you are. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we cut the Pentagon completely? And he said, not the Pentagon. And I said, okay, you're the big government guy. And
exactly.
so it led us into a much richer discussion about a simple fact, which is all governments, all they ever do is tax and spend. So rather than talking cliches, why don't we talk about who should we tax and what should we spend on?
Exactly.
And then we're having a real discussion as opposed to either an ad hominem, set of attacks or a bunch of slogans flying back and forth at each other. But I think it's our responsibility to move beyond cliche.
Yeah.
Not just the other guy.
But at the same time, there was a lot of stuff in there, okay? I mean, number one, you sort of pointed out this thing about, well, instead of fighting, we could be pulling babies out of the river, okay, and congratulating ourselves on all the babies we pull out of the river, okay? But I think the bigger problem is taking a foray upstream to figure out who's throwing babies into the river and stop that. So that's issue number one, is get to the root causes.
Let me stay on that for 1 minute. I know you've got others, but
I'm just picking this stuff out of what you're talking about.
No, I know, but it brings to mind a wonderful, wonderful poem by Bertolt Brecht, and it's a poem that begins by saying something like, I hear that there's a man on 23rd Street and Broadway who gives beds to the homeless. And he goes on to describe this man kind of offering the homeless a bed for the night. That's the name of the poem, A Bed for the Night. And then he shifts gears and he says, it won't solve the problem of inequality. It won't solve the problem of injustice. It won't do this and it won't do that. But for one night, this man has a bed, and the elements will be kept away from him. And then he completely shifts gears and says, for one night this guy has a bed, but it won't solve the problem of, and so he's saying both. And I think both are true. Yeah. I think in your life, in my life, if all we are is people who say, I'm changing the system and the little people can go screw themselves, that's not a moral way to live. But if all we do is say, I'm pulling babies from the river and I have no idea how to drain the river or stop the crime at the source. So both are true. And living a balanced life, I think, means finding a way to contribute and participate in both. I want to give a man a bed for the night, and I want to change the system that makes homelessness inevitable. Both.
Yeah. So, okay, but back to the issue of values. I sort of backing up a little bit. I used to do debates against creationists, and
my sympathies. Wow,
I was foolish enough. I sort of got sucked into it, and what was kind of interesting is I think when you think about penetrating into those groups, you're not going to get everybody. You can't win them all because their minds have essentially been adjusted. There's an internal world view that's consistent. For example, the war thing is about bullies on the playground. I had, years ago, I knew this woman down in Washington, D.C., who was writing a book, and I sort of lost track of her years ago. But so I'm up in her room, and she's got this wall of cassette tapes. And these are all interviews with officers at the Pentagon. And she says, pick one. Pick anyone. I don't care. Just pick it. So I just go pick one out and pull it off the shelf. She looks at it for a second and says, oh yeah, I remember this guy. And she starts to describe her interview with this guy. And it all came down to getting beaten up on the playground. I mean, this guy's a general now, okay? He's moving troops and buying weapon systems and doing all of this stuff. And, she says, the line that you want to know is about 30 minutes into this. We could fast forward the tape and I'll find it for you. And the line that appears on every one of those tapes is, I will never let it happen again. In other words, I got beat up on the playground and I will never let it happen again. And so when you start to think about the whole military, okay, it's about that particular response to that thing that happened. It's about family, it's about childhood, it's about school experiences, it's about all of this kind of stuff that sets up an internal dynamic. And then corporate America has become very good at pressing those buttons and getting people to, sort of toe the line. And they've been spending billions of dollars since the Powell letter. You're probably familiar with that.
Yeah.
Since 1971, basically programming the public. And so the question is, how do we break through that?
Well, the wonderful thing about human beings is that, you may be right. I mean, perhaps some of what you're thinking of is causing these behaviors and so on is true. But the wonderful thing about human beings is we are unpredictable, and we turn in opposite directions. We're not actually billiard balls. A billiard ball, you hit it here, it goes there. A human being, you hit it here, and it could go anywhere.
Exactly.
You have no idea where it might go, and this includes all the people who seem already programmed and set and so on. I've seen such radical changes in human beings in my short life, 68 years, that I'm confident that we are capable of doing an about face and doing things quite differently. I want to set up a different kind of notion of what causes what. And you were talking earlier about the polarization of the dialogue and the political space. But I think that comes from a very profound place. And that profound place is America in decline. The U.S. economic and political system in precipitous decline.
We have the exceptionalism versus the decline.
Absolutely.
And that's as much cognitive dissonance as you could possibly imagine.
Exactly. But the reality is going to impose itself on all of us, and it already is. No politician will talk about America in decline because they can't afford to. But every commentator from the left and the right is now talking about it, which is a kind of to read the Wall Street Journal is a shock to me, because I've thought that the U.S. economic political system was in decline since 1968. But I thought it was maybe 300, 400 years. And I was talking to an historian, he said, well, remember, Rome was in decline for 300, 400 years, and it was very painful, that decline. But now I see it accelerating in ways that are unimaginable a few years ago. In that decline, it's not easy to know how people are going to line up. But certainly the growth, to put it this way, another world is not only possible, it's inevitable. But that doesn't mean it's going to be a better world. It could be a world of nuclear war, of slave labor camps. It could be a world of fascism. Those are possibilities. It also could be
there are people working real hard to push us there.
And there's a natural inclination to that. So as you see life changing, the fear and the scapegoating and the hatred and so on gets a life of its own. That's one possibility. But it's also possible that we could learn to live differently, live not as patriots, but as world citizens. Live not as American exceptionalists, but as global human beings.
Or sort of our local little garden community.
Absolutely.
I mean, instead of global, maybe it's better to focus locally.
Well, both are. I like the idea of think globally, act locally. I like that. But I think that in reality, we see right in front of us the bad globalism all the time, but there's the good globalism as well. And the good globalism is international human rights, the women's movement, the spreading of kind of the queer movement, and the anti-war movement, and also the environmental connection. So I get very encouraged about a kind of globalism that's going to give us renewed strength and renewed perspective. But that is in conflict with this notion of retrenching and holding on. And so here's the reality that I look at. A shrinking economic power, a power that's losing its purchase on the future at the same time that we are expanding as a military power. That's a recipe for catastrophe. And I think we are living, in spite of our self-conception as a peaceful people and a peace-loving people, we're living in a violent and militarized world that we've created. Not just 150 military bases around the world, but simple little cultural things. Why is it that we all accept the fact that at athletic events and public ceremonies, we salute the flag and we sing patriotic songs? Why not having a group of kids read their poetry and then run through the stands and we all stand and sing "We Shall Overcome"? I mean, that to me is a more hopeful future than this kind of militarized future, this kind of patriotic, narrowed future, or one that drives me crazy, although I said this out loud and the right has gone nuts about it on the blogosphere, but I really think it's telling. You go to the airport, you're waiting to get on the plane, and they say, "We'd like to invite uniformed military to board first and thank you for your service." And I invariably say, why don't we let the teachers and nurses board first and thank them for their service? And it always makes people, a little weirded out. But what I mean by that is that to conflate service with military service, to conflate those who help us live a free and happy life with soldiers who are occupying overseas, is to say we are a militaristic culture, and we need to fight that.
But that's the fine art of co-opting people.
Well, exactly.
I mean, and there's a group of people spending,
Overtime.
billions of dollars, working 24/7 to get us to do that kind of crap.
Absolutely. And we need to oppose it. And that's all I'm saying. What I'm saying is this is a contested space. It's not a settled space.
Oh, it's not settled at all.
Not at all.
But it's been cored out.
Well, to some degree. But when I say we live in a militarized culture, I also want to say the value of peace, the value of nonviolence, the value of learning to live together so others can live, that value is alive too. So in that contested space, I don't want to cede any ground. That's why I want to say to the airlines clerks, what about letting the teachers get on first, or the firefighters? The idea of challenging it everywhere it rises its head, it seems to me, is a hugely important thing for all of us to commit to.
Yeah. So, where do we go from here?
Let's talk about education and social justice.
Oh, you mean actually talk about the title of the show?
One of the reasons I'm thinking that actually is because when we were talking earlier about being global citizens and people retrenching into a kind of American exceptionalism, I actually think this is an educational or a pedagogical problem. Yeah. And I think that, one of the things that I often comes to my mind is that the National Geographic did a survey of 18 to 25-year-old American kids, and they gave them a blank world map. Now, we are 4.5% or so of the world's population, and yet our self-conception is we're all there is.
Right.
We are it. So these kids were given, and they're not stupid kids, they're given a world map. 80% couldn't find Iraq.
Right.
80% couldn't find Israel, Palestine. 40% couldn't find Great Britain. And an astonishing 12% couldn't find the United States. Many of us feel self-satisfied when I say that last thing because we could find the United States. But the rest of it, a little dicey, not so much. Yeah. I remember being in Rwanda at the 10th anniversary of the genocide with my wife who had taken a law school class there. We went to a high school in a refugee camp. And a kid heard that we were from Chicago, and he went to his work folder, and he pulled out a freehand sketch he had done of the United States of America. And he said, Chicago, right here on the Great Lakes of North America, just as we are on the Great Lakes of Central Africa. And my response was, do I know there's a Great Lakes in Central Africa? Do any of my students know that? But of course, that's the ignorance of privilege. Yeah. That's the anesthetization of privilege. We are put to sleep by the fact that we think we're the center of the world. Our privilege allows us to think that. And anybody in Europe looks at the United States and thinks smiles benignly and says, you don't know where you are and you don't know who you are. You don't know history and you don't know geography. But that to me is a social justice
But the
question.
reality is if you went back 100 years, to Great Britain, you would have the same problem there.
Exactly my point.
And if you went back 200 years to France, you'd have the same problem there.
Exactly my point. I mean, the whole imperial mission from France was called the civilizing mission. Yeah. They were bringing civilization to Indochina and to Algeria. And England the same. I mean, if you read, I just read recently a recently published history of Hawaii, and you listen to these missionaries and these beneficent, imperialists, and they are literally saying of the Hawaiians, they're a savage people. They don't speak a human language. They sound like monkeys chattering, right? And meanwhile, they're bringing them the trifecta, electoral politics, capitalism, and the American way of life. Yeah. And that's the benefit that they're bringing. But they're crushing any notion of the humanity of the people that they're invading. So this is the classic imperial move. We're now in the age of anti-imperialism, and it's not just Britain and France and Germany and Portugal that are being beaten back, but now it's the United States. Yeah. And new imperialisms are rising. So I have no love of Chinese imperialism, but I do think we have to come to grips with the fact that the empire is shrinking, and you and I, and everybody who's watching this has a huge responsibility to participate in what's next, because the outcome is far from clear. And that means, to me, a kind of simple formula to say, hard to do, which is to agitate for more democracy, more peace, and more participation. How much and how we do that? Very complicated. But I look at Occupy and I say, wow, they've opened a space where we can have this conversation in a new way that was impossible a year ago.
Yeah.
And that's a phenomenally exciting thing.
Mm-hmm. So Occupy's got a lot of issues. It was sort of put to me that what people do is they form, they storm, they norm, and then they perform.
Nice.
And
it rhymes. It's kind of like Muhammad Ali. It's awesome.
Something like that. And so Occupy, sort of formed, and everybody had their focus was on the camps. And then once the camps disappeared, it's still around, and we're sort of looking at there's so many issues, from the environment to healthcare to foreclosures to bankruptcies to it just goes on and on and on. And everybody's got their own little thing that they think's the most important, but it's really not the issues, not the individual little things. It's a whole change in worldview. It's an attitudinal thing. It's what is our view of ourselves and our relationship to the remainder of the world. And
I think that's huge, and that goes right to your question of values. But just to add on to your notion of what is Occupy, I think that people make a mistake when they think of Occupy as a point of arrival. Occupy is an invitation. It's an opening, and it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
And as a metaphor, it couldn't be more powerful. So suddenly, even on Wall Street, they're talking about the 1% and the 99%, and you have Wall Street bankers saying about Senator Gillibrand, she doesn't know who her constituency is. It's us.
Yeah.
It's the 1%. And there are many, many examples of how this is played out. But I think if you think of it as a metaphor and a point of a point of departure, not a point of arrival, then it's incumbent on all of us to kind of participate and figure out what's next. And what's next, it seems to me, is precisely this conversation about what is our view of ourselves and how is that shifting, and then how do we organize ourselves to be an irresistible force in pushing toward a new way of living and a new way of being. Economic inequality is part of it. Peace is part of it. Being global citizens is part of it. Yeah. And these are issues that are absolutely at the core of whether we're going to have a future worth living.
So these are themes, okay?
Yeah.
In the sense that when we had a camp, okay, everybody sort of did their piece. There was, I think of a couple of people, Karen, who decided she was going to deal with recycling and garbage and the other stuff, and she had her little crew, and they took care of dealing with that. And she picked off her piece, and I thought she should be sainted. I mean, just to show up every day and deal with garbage.
It's a wonderful thing.
And she's bright, she's energetic, she's just a wonderful human being. But it was like, nobody's doing that, and that's the niche I'm going to take because it needs to be done.
It's funny that you picked that up, because I went down to Camp Casey down at George Bush's White House in Texas when it first opened up as an encampment. Yeah. And I had never been at a peace camp that was run by the military. I found it the most fascinating and fun thing to be a part of. It was all the Iraq vets against the war were running it, and all the military families. And so, I signed up for the garbage detail. And most peace camps I've been a part of, garbage, we'll get to it when we get to it, or lunch, somewhere around noon or 4. And here I was in a camp that was a peace camp, but it was like lunch is at noon, and you eat between 12 and 12:30. You don't eat, and I started saluting and shit. But I just think that's an interesting thing about Occupy is you can find your own space and organize yourself to be a contributing member of community. And when people started chanting in Washington or in Detroit, this is what democracy looks like, I really loved that. And of course, the New York Times naturally would sneer at it and say, oh, look, there's a battle between the homeless and the intellectuals. Well, look, in this wild and crazy and diverse society, why wouldn't there be issues trying to figure out how to talk between these kids from Columbia University and NYU and these folks who've been living on the street for the last decade? Of course, there's difficulty learning how to talk, but learning how to talk to one another and learning to find the common ground of values and activity is precisely the work of democracy. So why should we sneer at it? Why shouldn't we leap into the wreckage and get busy finding a way. And that's what I think Occupy has offered us.
So, the question is, where does Occupy go from here? And I really am thinking that what we need is a focus, a campaign, and then what happens is once people sort of get onto that, then the roles become clear, the things that need to be done become clear, people can shave off their niches and contribute. But right now we've sort of to a degree lost the focus. We understand what the problems are. It's greed and corruption. It's causing problems throughout the world. But the issue is, and I agree with what you just wrote there.
Greed.
And greed, corruption, and and you put down violence as a tool that keeps greed and corruption in place. But the issue is, how do we create a situation where we're actually solving a problem, doing something for the community, while at the same time providing us the opportunity to talk about the larger issues that we want to talk about, which is the greed, the corruption, the violence, and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, I have a couple reactions to that. One is, let's not move too fast to try to codify and issue orient what is at this moment a spontaneous uprising. When people say Occupy doesn't have a demand or Occupy is not serious, Bill Clinton, I salute Occupy. Now they have to get in behind Obama's jobs program. I want to run and scream the other direction or jump off a bridge or something. But no, we don't need to kind of push ourselves and hammer ourselves into that kind of narrow agenda. And certainly we don't need to be co-opted by the Democratic Party, and that's a real danger.
No, I'm not suggesting that we go that way. The thing that I'm sort of suggesting now and pushing, and there's a couple other campaigns that are worthy. We've done a lot of work in this area on foreclosures and had some fairly nice victories, saved a few families from getting booted into the streets. Another thing that we've made a lot of progress on is homelessness. And
that's great.
So the issue now is we've opened up enough of a space that it's possible to get a village for the homeless, because there's thousands of them in this area here.
Yeah.
And it's become a serious problem, recognized by lots of people in the community.
Sure.
How they define what the problem is an issue, but there's enough awareness that a real solution, in other words, actually giving them a place where it's legal to exist, may be the thing. And I'm pushing that as the project. And I think that if what happens is Occupy were to focus in on a local thing that we could win, that we would find ourselves being far more effective in reaching out into the community.
You may be right, and you're part of Occupy, so you get up at the General Assembly, make your pitch, and see what happens. But
Which I have.
The only way to be a part of it is to be a part of it, And I've been to 14 Occupy sites, and they are each different by nature.
Yeah.
So Chicago is an intersection. It's not even an occupied site. Detroit and Washington, D.C. are like homeless shelters. Boston is like an open-air public library. And so they take different forms. But I would say that out of Occupy, in Chicago, for example, the metaphor of Occupy has taken the form of resisting Mayor Rahm Emanuel's closing of the mental health clinics. So we occupy the mental health clinics. Resisting the closing of the schools. So we occupy the Board of Education. And this is a way for us to mic check and a way for us to develop a public response. It's a vehicle for that. But going back, people say it doesn't have a coherent program. Look at the tapes of the free speech movement and Mario Savio. What's his program? He doesn't have a program. What he has is a moral statement about being left out and being pushed out and being oppressed. And in that moral statement, a lot of space opens up for people to do very particular things about free speech, about opening the university, about open admissions, and a lot of other things. So I think that's where we are. If you want to organize, for example, along the lines of the Take Back the Land movement in Florida, or in Chicago, or the anti-foreclosure work in Chicago, or the squatters in Switzerland and Spain, which I think is something that we can learn a lot from, is to take the land and demand that it be put to social use. We need to get away from what all the politicians are telling us, which is jobs, 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 by which they mean prison guards and casino dealers and crap like that. And we need to say, no, work, work, work. Rehab housing. Find a way to create the city for the homeless. Take back the land. These are the kinds of things that Occupy offers. The other one that pops to my mind in a community like this, as soon as you say, create a space for the homeless, the Mad Housers in Chicago are another group that just just puts up spontaneous housing for folks, and then the city comes and rips it down. But they hold it for a long enough time that it actually represents a bed for the night. But the other one is cancel the debt, the student debt.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the student debt is the next housing bubble waiting to implode. And why not?
It has imploded.
Why not get
huge?
Millions and millions of people, including me, incidentally, who's still paying a student debt for one of my kids, get us all to say we're not going to pay back those debts. And once we get 5 million signatures on a petition, we'll all on the same day refuse. And let's just see what happens. It's one of those kind of, organized kind of trigger moments where you say, if we get 5 million, we're going to say, no, we're not going to pay any longer. And I would be happy to do that. And are they going to put all 5 million of us in debtor's prison? I don't think so. I think that's where you begin to change the frame. So I'm open to a lot of possibilities, but let's not, rush to say it's one thing and not many, many, kind of offspring of Occupy that kind of eddy forth and do the work. Okay. One last thing I want to just add. I know I went on, but let me just add one last thing. I don't think that the issue is particularly greed and corruption. I actually think corruption is endemic in a system like this, and I think greed is just kind of another name for finance. I think it's the system itself. I think it's the system of capitalism, and I think that good people get caught up in capitalism and become corrupted because it's a corrupting system. It's corrupt at its core. And so I think we have to be talking very seriously, and I am talking in Occupy Chicago and a lot of other places, about the fact that capitalism has exhausted itself. Yeah. It's not only not good for the world, we can't sustain it for another generation. No. The planet will be dead with endless expansion and endless consumption and endless production of meaningless nonsense like war. So we have to, I think, begin to have a serious talk, and Occupy is a great site to have that talk, about how do we end the system that makes corruption and greed inevitable, and how do we create the possibility of at least a discussion of another way of organizing ourselves socially, economically, and so on.
Well, it's a question. I mean, there's a circle there.
Yeah, there is.
This causes this, causes this, causes this, causes this, causes the original, and it's a feedback system, and we continue to sort of slam into a state. And so where you pick to start on the circle is not as important as the fact that we got to get out of that existing state.
Well, and we have to reframe the issues, and then we have to connect the issues. So war is connected to warming. They're not two separate events. And we need to see those connections. And seeing those connections is the real weaving together of a social movement that can make a difference. But the reason I kind of want to take it away from the individual who's corrupt or the individual who's greedy is that with any kind of historical memory, you can see that every month a new greedy, corrupt official is discovered.
There's always a supply of bad apples.
But it's more than bad apples. It's the orchard that's poisoned.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we need to dig up the orchard and imagine a different way of planting and a different way of
stop
living.
Spraying the poison on the orchard. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not that I don't want to either dismiss and say, oh well, whoever these, this particular guy who's in prison is innocent. He's not innocent. I mean, Bernie Madoff is guilty for what he did, but at the same time, it's much deeper than Bernie Madoff. It's like blaming the soldier in Vietnam for the war crime he committed. He is responsible. You have to take him as a responsible person, but follow it up the chain of command, and you see it's not just this soldier, it's his sergeant, it's his captain, it's his lieutenant, and at the end of the day, it's Kissinger and Nixon and Johnson, and these are the people who should be tried for war crimes, not this kid. I mean, the kid, yes, but
bringing it back to our times, it's Bush and Obama.
Well, exactly.
So, yeah,
exactly.
precisely.
And one of the real sad things about the political class has no answers.
Yeah.
And not only is the economic system finished, but the political class has no answers. And since they have no answers, it's up to us, and it's another reason that I salute Occupy. It opens a space where we can discover our own answers. Right. And frankly, I think the biggest obstacle to us being able to kind of remake and reframe the society we live in is our own lack of confidence in ourselves.
Absolutely.
And a thing like Occupy builds confidence. It builds the capacity to say, why do we need a mayor in Chicago? What does the mayor do? And everybody gets nervous. And, well, what would we do without a mayor? I don't know. What would you do without prisons? I mean, can we imagine a world without prisons? I can. What would we do? Well, we'd be freer and happier and better. And then we'd figure out about how to take care of the community and issues of public safety and so on. But it's not that prisons, because they're there, are either inevitable or beyond history or outside of human agency. There they are. Let's do something about that.
So, but prisons in the United States, I mean, if you are an imperial power or the imperial power, I mean, you essentially have to deal with all the people you don't want to deal with. Exactly. And so whether we're talking about, in other words, each of the empires had their prison system, and it was exceptional at the time that it occurred, but then once the empire faded, there was no longer the need for the prison system.
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that, history is filled with kind of complex and contradictory examples, but the interesting thing about prisons in the United States is there's never been a carceral state like this state. Yeah. 2.5 million of our fellow citizens and residents in prison.
It's about 1%, almost 1%.
It's the wrong 1%.
Yeah, really.
Let's shift gears and put that other 1%.
Yeah, I mean, those people are in prison for doing the same things that if you were rich, if you did them, you would get rewarded.
Well, it's the old joke about the fact that if you rob a bank, you go to jail, but if you own a bank, and you're a thief at that level, you don't go to jail. But the prisons are an interesting case in point here because, again, we see an empire in decline. We see a society that is, in many ways, coming apart at the seams. Yep. And how do you discipline the working class? How do you discipline the African American community? And one of the answers is you build a carceral state, you build a school system in which it really is a school to prison pipeline. Yep. If you go to these schools on the west side of Chicago, the chances of you dropping out are so high, and the only benefit left for you is the prison. You have no right to a mental health system or a library or a school, but you do have the benefit of a prison system.
So we have the separate but equal thing going on, when in reality they're not even close to equal. I mean, the difference between a private school for the wealthy that somebody drops, $40,000 or $50,000 a year on for tuition versus the largely defunded school in some poor neighborhood. Yeah. They are separate, but they are not close to equal.
Well, here's the stunning thing. I mean, I wrote a book about kids in prison about a decade ago, and I spent 2 years in the largest and oldest juvenile detention center in the world, which is in Chicago. And it costs as much to put a kid in that prison for a year as it does to send them to Lake Forest Academy, the Tony Prep School on the north side where I went to school. So it's an astonishing thing that we're willing to, if we just gave that $40,000 to the kid and said, go to Lake Forest Academy, I mean, what a different world we'd live in. But without being facetious or silly about it, the truth is that we have gotten ourselves locked into a mentality, a frame that says punishment, that says crime equals punishment, punishment equals prison. And if you stop that frame and say, what are 100 alternatives to incarceration? What can we do rather than put you in a cage if you break the law and so on? Then you begin to think of differently about education, about drug treatment, about mental health, about a lot of other issues, about homelessness and poverty. And you begin to wonder, what else could we do? State of Illinois is a great example, and I'm sure it's true in Oregon. We have spent more in the last 30 years on prison construction than we have on higher education construction by factors of 100. Yeah. And it's a ridiculous dead end for any kind of future worth having to invest all that in caging people and to disinvest in the idea that education could strengthen our democracy, could strengthen our social fabric.
Yeah, but one of them supports the power and control of the existing elites, and the other one doesn't.
Well, yes and no, and that's where it gets kind of funny, because even in their own terms, they're driving. I mean, the powerful, the 1%, are driving us towards the cliff, and so even in their own terms, they're creating these little golden parachutes for themselves. But there isn't going to be a world, left for them. And South Africa, the old South Africa, is such a great metaphor. How high can you build that wall? How big can your gated community become before it implodes? And we all know it will. We all know that system that they created in South Africa, where some kids went to a school with state-of-the-art equipment and 15 kids to a class, and some went to a shack with no roof where there were 100 kids to a teacher.
Class.
That system couldn't last, and that system blew up in their face. So in an odd way, folks are caught in a contradiction. You're right, in a sense. If you were part of the powerful and looking at the future, you might say, more prisons, more war, more... But you also would be caught, because you would recognize, I think, that is a dead end. So which do I do? If I reform, that might open the gates to revolution. If I don't reform, that might open the gates to revolution. The good news is the gates to revolution are waiting to be opened. And so let's get busy.
Okay, so we got about another minute and a half. So
holy cow.
Annie, it went fast. So
it's such a pleasure talking to you.
Any closing thoughts that you... you got probably 5,000 or 6,000 people who watch this show. So what do you want to say to 5,000 or 6,000 people in Eugene?
That's intimidating, to say that. I mean, it was just you and me a minute ago. I don't really have any big last words. I do think that it's been a great thing for me to be here in Eugene and to be in Oregon. I'm going up to a comics festival tomorrow in Portland. But one of the things that I felt again and again, and I do feel, is that young people are so filled with energy, with wisdom, and finding outlets, finding ways to both become active, to open our eyes and act on what we see, is the big demand that we all face.
Well, it's not just that, but what you said was have fun.
Gotta have fun.
Gotta have fun, and that's I think if you're not enjoying your life, then you need to get that fixed.
Well, Emma Goldman said, "If I can't dance at your revolution, I don't want to come." And we could sign off with a simple slogan, which is joy and justice. I mean, that's what we should live for: joy and justice.
So let's throw another slogan, because we still have 30 seconds.
Well, there are a lot of them, but
so got any favorites?
One of my all-time favorites that resonated through my head this whole time we were talking was something I heard when I was 20 years old. The president of SDS, at the time, Students for Democratic Society, said to a group of us in Ann Arbor, "Don't let your life make a mockery of your values." And it seems to me that reminds us that we have values. We ought to uncover them, dust them off, put them in the foreground, and then try to live in concert with those values. That's what I try to do, and fail every day, but get up the next day and try again.
It's tough, isn't it?
It is.
And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Good luck.
So that was episode number 33 of Occupy TV, and we will see you folks next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's